Welcome to History Respawned. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. Today's episode considers one of the most beloved and revered console games of all time, Red Dead Redemption. Developed by Rockstar, Red Dead takes place in a fictional western U.S. state along the Mexican border in 1911. The game follows the story of John Marston, a former outlaw who is being forced by the U.S. government to eliminate members of his old gang. During his journey in the American West and Mexico, Marston encounters a cast of Western archetypes, including snake oil salesmen, treasure hunters, lawmen, outlaws, and Mexican revolutionaries. With me to discuss this game is John Moran Gonzalez, a professor in the English department at the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Gonzalez is an expert on the history of American literature and culture, and is the recipient of major fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Woodrow Wilson National Foundation. He is a faculty affiliate of the Center for Mexican American Studies at the University of Texas, and is also one of the leaders of the Refusing to Forget project. John, welcome to the show.
Great to be here.
John, Red Dead Redemption is a game with a historical setting, but it's a historical setting that is heavily influenced and informed by the American Western, a popular genre for both books and films. And it's difficult to play Red Dead and not be reminded of topics and themes from the books of Louis L'Amour and the spaghetti westerns of the 1960s. My question to you is, what makes the West such a popular setting for American fiction, and why has that popularity endured for so long?
I think to answer that question, we really have to go back to the early part of the 19th century, or perhaps even earlier to the 18th century, where the West in the U.S. imagination has always been considered the land of opportunity, the place where dreams can happen that are unrealizable on the East Coast or in Britain before that. And so the kind of idea of the virgin land, as Henry Nash Smith once put it, was that whereas the place where one lived was always kind of limited in the opportunities that were available because of class, limits on class mobility, and that sort of thing, the West represented a space where there was no so-called civilization, where there were no, as it were, artificial limits to where the natural abilities of an individual could be fully realized. And so from that era on, and we're talking about the annexation of what was called the Old Northwest, that is the territories we now know as the Midwest, Michigan, Ohio, the Ohio Valley. Ever since that time, the westward expansion was synonymous with the opening up of opportunity for the individual. And I think this got effectively nationalized, or it became a national project with in the 1840s when John Sullivan coined the term manifest destiny. And ever since then, the idea of the U.S. as in search of a new frontier, of that new place where the self, the individual, could be fully realized in the absence of artificial constraints such as social convention or government interference, I think remains a powerful narrative to this day.
Interesting. Well, one of the defining features of American Westerns is the presence of violence. And Red Dead Redemption is no exception to this. Players in Red Dead participate in duels, shootouts, and pitched battles. They can also hunt and kill wild animals. My question is, does the presence of violence in Westerns like Red Dead reflect the reality of life in the West during the 19th and early 20th centuries?
Well, certainly. I mean, there are a couple of aspects to that. I think one of them is that there is some truth to the idea that the mechanisms of civil society and of law enforcement in particular were in fact weaker. You know, there's a real sense in which the idea of sovereignty, that is of national sovereignty and authority and therefore power, was actually much less complete than I think we tend to believe. It was like patches and holes, and there were these patches and holes in sovereignty were exploited by all kinds of people. I mean, certainly outlaws and smugglers and, folks like that come to mind. But I think, certainly Native Americans used and challenged the kind of, sovereignty of the United States in this era, where effectively the United States, in name had sovereignty over this territory, but in reality did not control it. And so I think various groups with various widely varying agendas took advantage of this. And certainly the violence, or the ability to inflict violence with fewer repercussions, was certainly an element of everyday life here. On the other hand, I'm not sure that the kind of the depiction of like constant bloodbaths, as depicted in the game, was quite the reality. I think those were much rarer than the game might have us believe.
It's interesting you mentioned the borderlands as an area of competing sovereignty, and you definitely get a sense of that in the game, where you have the United States government moving in, the Mexican national government, the Mexican rebels, or also Native American groups, and your player character is kind of caught in the middle of all of these things as they develop.
That's right. That's right. I mean, and certainly the borderlands have always been an area where that sovereignty has been of both nations, of both Mexico and the United States, has been at times quite tenuous. And one only need think of the terms of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848 at the end of the U.S.-Mexican War that established the boundaries. To sum that up, the terms of it, the United States essentially, after occupying much of Mexico, forced Mexico to cede its northern half to the United States, and these are the states that now make up what we call the U.S. Southwest. But one of the interesting provisions of that treaty was that the United States would patrol the border. The interesting thing was that it wasn't about keeping Mexicans out of the United States. It was about keeping Native American tribal nations, such as the powerful Apache and Comanche, out of Mexico. And so that points to how Native American groups were using the fluidity of sovereignty along the border to their advantage. This task proved so impossible. The United States renegotiated that provision of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and basically dropped it because the United States could not control its own border in that way. And at that point, essentially from 1848 through 1924, the border was unregulated as far as the passage of people, north or south. It was essentially an open border. And sure, you had customs because, of course, officials on both sides were interested in collecting taxes on goods as they crossed the borders. And they might even charge a toll, to cross an international bridge or use a ferry. But there was no checking of documents for people. So this meant that the border, up until the creation of the Border Patrol in 1924, and the series of restrictive immigration laws enacted at that point, the border was incredibly fluid, and therefore the sovereignty and state authority over those were actually quite limited at times.
Yeah, and I think the game actually does a pretty good job of depicting this freedom with which people in the borderlands felt with crossing national boundaries. For instance, your player character, John Marston, goes freely across the border, but so do other NPCs, non-player characters in the game. And very often as you're traveling throughout both countries, you'll notice NPCs from America or NPCs from Mexico going across the border, doing business in other areas. And they do this without any real respect for the river itself as a boundary. They seem perfectly free to go back and forth as they please.
That's right. And really for generations along the border, and certainly along the Texas-Mexico border, the river meant nothing as far as a divide. I mean, families lived on both sides of the river and crossed back and forth. Business, of course, did the same. Really, the border was not a border in the sense that we think of it today until 1924.
Right. So you mentioned several times so far the kind of relationship between Mexico and the United States at this time, and this game includes a depiction of the Mexican Revolution and what influence that had on Mexican-American relations at the time. And the main character, John Marston, goes on missions for both the rebels and the military leaders in Mexico, but throughout the game you're never really giving any context for that revolution, and you're never really given an explanation as to what the stakes are for Mexico. So I'm wondering if you could provide our viewers with a brief background in the history and the course of the Mexican Revolution.
Absolutely. Really, the 30 years prior to 1911 were crucial for this story because in about 1870, Porfirio Diaz became president, but de facto dictator of Mexico. And he very much ruled with an iron fist for decades. And it this era came to be known as the Porfiriato. And so he also used his both secret police as well as the mounted rural police, or the rurales, to effectively squash any dissent. And a great deal of his project for the modernization of Mexico, as he saw it, was the importation of European ideals of progress. And so he was a great fan of French science of that era. But he also acknowledged the kind of reality of capital investment by the United States and Great Britain as well. And so he opened up many of the heavy industries, especially in the export-driven sector, to U.S. and British capital. And so by 1910, when the revolution started, these foreign interests controlled a huge chunk of the Mexican economy and the Mexican economic infrastructure. So this resulted in the kind of average citizen in the countryside as well as in the cities. This created a great division of wealth, a great imbalance in between the very wealthy and the very, very poor. And of course, indigenous communities in Mexico were even marginalized further. So basically, the revolution should be more properly thought of as a civil war. It was a civil war. It was incredibly bloody. It lasted for a decade. And it cost, there were about 1 million Mexicans who lost their lives in the revolution. As you can imagine, the country's economy was absolutely wrecked. And also, it caused nearly 1 million more Mexicans to flee to the United States as war refugees. So really, the Mexican Revolution was the origin of the first what we might think of as the first great wave of Mexican migration to the United States, but they were not, as it were, primarily economic migrants in the way we might think of today. They were war refugees, much more like the Syrian war refugees today. Of course, it was the enactment of the immigration reform laws and the creation of the Border Patrol in 1924 was actually in response to this mass migration from Mexico, among other things, but it was a major factor in the implementation of those laws. So I should also add that revolutions or revolts against Porfirio Diaz had been launched from the borderlands for decades prior to 1910. So in the early 1890s, Catarino Garza launched a would-be revolutionary attempt from the borderlands region in South Texas. And there were other instances of plotting and organizing and fundraising and arms smuggling to overthrow the Mexican government from the U.S. side. On the other hand, as you might imagine, the U.S. and Mexican governments very much saw eye to eye on the need to suppress these uprisings. And so the U.S. authorities often intervened at the behest of Porfirio Diaz to arrest and imprison would-be revolutionaries on the U.S. side.
Well, I don't find it surprising that the United States, given the context of the First World War and then the beginnings of the Red Scare, would want to participate with Mexico in putting down a peasant revolution.
Well, I think the realities of the revolution on the ground as it proceeded did change the foreign policy tactics of the United States, as they saw that Porfirio Diaz had actually pretty early on, I mean, by 1911, had fled for France. But the revolution continued because there had been a counter-revolution against what had been the kind of middle-class reformist Francisco Madero by one of Diaz's generals. And then in turn, he was overthrown by a coalition of revolutionary forces led by Emiliano Zapata in the southern states of Mexico, and then in the northern states, Pancho Villa, and then in the central areas by Venustiano Carranza. And it was Carranza who wound up taking the de facto reins of government and eventually getting recognition by the United States as the legitimate government of Mexico. Of course, he was assassinated in his turn, and Mexico did not achieve a kind of political stability until Obregón assumed power.
So I wanted to shift focus back for a moment to the topic of violence. And, most American Westerns, including Red Dead Redemption, they tend to focus on violence that's between outlaws and lawmen. But they rarely discuss violence perpetrated against marginalized groups. And you are leader of a project called Refusing to Forget, which is trying to call attention to one of these forgotten histories of violence in the American West during the time period in which Red Dead Redemption is set. And I was wondering if you could tell our viewers a bit more about Refusing to Forget.
Well, the Refusing to Forget project, as you pointed out, is really about bringing to public consciousness an event that occurred 100 years ago in South Texas and other areas of Texas that have been largely forgotten. And essentially what happened 100 years ago was there was a changing social and economic conditions had displaced Texas Mexicans from what had been their positions of land ownership and citizenship privilege, right? You have to remember in the lower Rio Grande Valley of South Texas, life since 1848 up through the beginning of the 20th century had been very much as it had been before the change in national sovereignty. So this was one of those instances where, yes, the U.S. was the national sovereign of this area, but really the people of the region looked to Mexico in its politics and economics and culture. And so in many ways, they were still indistinguishable from Mexicans, and they thought of themselves as Mexican. When you talked about the capital of the nation or the capital, you didn't talk about D.C., you talked about the DF. And so, and the peso was the common currency of the region. You use dollars to pay your taxes, but you use pesos and everything else. And so the thing was that unlike in other areas of the United States, such as most of California or with the possible exception of New Mexico, Texas Mexicans in this area had not been relegated to second-class status. They still held political power and economic power. But the arrival of the railroad into this region of South Texas in 1904 changed all that. And so there was a very rapid transition from a ranching economy controlled by Texas Mexicans to agribusiness economy that was controlled by newcomer Anglo-Americans, mostly from the Midwest, the U.S. Midwest. And so the newcomers, unlike previous migrants from the U.S. to this part of the border, who had acculturated and become Mexicanized, these newcomers had no desire to do so, and because they were bringing with them their beliefs in the racial inferiority of the largely mestizo or mixed blood native, indigenous, and European Mexican people. And so they very quickly instituted a version of segregation, of racial segregation that we might conveniently call Juan Crow. And so, of course, the Tejanos or the Texas Mexicans were completely unused to this and completely insulted, as you might imagine. And in 1915, had a group of displaced rancheros and other people, disaffected folks, basically started an armed uprising, a rebellion in South Texas. And so you had groups of maybe 10 to 25 horsemen riding around the South Texas brush country, attacking farms and irrigation systems and automobiles. And in one case, they wrecked a train. And so now the thing is that this was about from July through November of 1915. And very quickly, the local authorities, local law enforcement, and then the Texas Rangers came in to put down the uprising. The problem was that they made it into a collective punishment of the Texas Mexican community of that area. So there were many Texas Mexicans who really had nothing to do with these raids, who were tortured or killed for no other reason than being a suspicious Mexican. And in the kind of historical kind of trajectory of these events, this was really a kind of ethnic cleansing of the landed political class of Texas Mexicans to make way for Anglo-Texan ownership and control of the region. It also, of course, meant sending a message to the remaining Texas Mexican population that that white supremacy was here to stay in this region. And it's these events, the kind of extra legal, extrajudicial kind of killings of a good number of Texas Mexicans of this community that the Refusing to Forget Project wants to remember that there was essentially a race war in South Texas at this time. Even the New York Times was calling it this. And it received widespread attention throughout the national media. And essentially, the Texas Rangers served as a state-sanctioned police force that was executing innocent people without due process of any kind. The end of the story, as it were, was in 1919, a state representative named J.T. Canales initiated an investigation of the activities of the Texas Rangers in the previous decade in the state legislature. And while there was huge amounts of evidence and testimony collected, but no indictments or convictions of any Rangers occurred. However, it significantly downsized the Ranger force, and it also significantly professionalized the Ranger force. And so, in other words, it did a lot to kind of tampen down the worst of the worst practices. Not that it didn't continue to occur at another level, but nonetheless, this was the first time that Texas Mexicans had been successful in using the mechanisms of the state to address the issue of state violence against their own community. So this prior to that, for the Rangers, it was like anything goes. They knew that they would never be prosecuted for doing this stuff. But after that, it was kind of like, well, no, there are going to be consequences for those kind of actions.
It's interesting, and speaking as a native Texan myself, I'm ashamed to say that I didn't know anything about this racial violence during this time period. Is there anywhere else that our viewers can go to learn a bit more about Refusing to Forget and this history?
Absolutely. We've got a website at refusingtoforget.org. And you can also take a look at the exhibit. It's called Life and Death on the Border, 1910 to 1920, which is currently running through April 3rd, 2016 at the Bob Bullock Texas State History Museum here in Austin, Texas.
Well, that's going to do it for this episode of History Respawned. Thank you so much to Professor Gonzalez for joining us on the show. Please tune in next month for another episode.